Leadership from Ward County, Surrey, Burlington, and the city of Minot gathered together today for a metropolitan planning meeting. Harold Stewart, Minot city manager, says they're continuing the process of establishing an organization that directs federal funding for roads, bridges, and public transit throughout the county. He says it was created by the governor so they would be eligible for federal funds.
Federal funding would allow us to do the planning and create those planning documents and eventually potentially have some funding towards the projects themselves later on down the road.
He says one of the projects might include the Broadway Highway.